Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Rob Vischer. I'm the dean here at the law school, and we're excited to be hosts for this conversation today. One of the exciting prospects for us 4 or 5 years ago when we decided to get into the burgeoning field of ethics and compliance education is that the field itself is still growing, still building its own self-awareness and conception of what it is as a professional field, the ethics and compliance field. And I think that's actually an advantage because it proves malleable and flexible as new challenges present themselves on the horizon, maybe even more malleable and flexible and adaptive than the traditional practice of law has been over the past years. What that means for us, though, as the venue for the educational aspect of this profession is that we want to be a venue for the cutting edge conversations where it's not this simple, we just present answers that have long been fixed in the professional horizon, but where we're struggling together to figure out what we know about ethics means in light of new challenges. And today is a great example of that. We want to be the place where the best thinking in this field comes, not just for the benefit of our students, but for the benefits of our faculty and the benefits of industry. So that's why we're hosting this. We're glad you're here. He's glad you're here too. And we're gonna kick off from here and let the experts start providing some answers and probably posing some questions. But before we kick off with the panel, I'm going to turn it over to the director of our Ethics and Compliance program, Colleen Dorsey. And give her an extra round of applause because she is hosting an event on her birthday. So she gets extra credit.
Thank you, Dean Vischer. I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank our co-sponsors today, which is the Opus College of Business, especially the folks with the Strategic Certificate program, and Holleran Center. They have been kind enough to help sponsor this event. I want to introduce the panelists, which is an amazing group of people. I think that you will all agree that they're very accomplished, and we've gathered really an amazing group for you all to pose questions or to think through artificial intelligence. There's a lot that can be said about this topic. We could go in a lot of different directions, but what we've tried to do is really hone down today's presentation and panel to 3 goals. The first one is really to provide you all, and really us, with a better understanding of what AI is and what it's not. The other thing that we really want to do is provide you all with information about how it's being used today that you may be aware of, you may not be aware of. And then lastly, we want to provide information to the attendees to really get an understanding of how you can bring this back to your own organizations and help. And at least at a minimum, start thinking about the issues because they are vast and myriad. I had the pleasure of reading a lot about this topic in the last few weeks, and it really is a fast-moving, dynamic topic that needs to be started. And so I think it's fair to say none of us up here feel like we're experts in the subject matter, but it's at least a conversation that they are well suited to speak to, and that will get the conversation going. So, beginning with Eileen Locke, to my immediate right here. Eileen is General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer of IEEE, the world's largest technical professional organization for the advancement of technology. Eileen Locke joined IEEE in 2011. Eileen has worked in both the public and private sectors on significant international investments. She earned her BA degree in International Relations from the University of Minnesota, graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa. She earned her Juris Doctor degree from New York University School of Law and a Master of Public Affairs with a concentration in International Relations and Development Economics from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Ms. Locke speaks Hindi and Spanish and has studied the French and Russian languages. Katie Lawler, who's up here in the pink, is Senior Vice President and Global Chief Ethics Officer of U.S. Bank. In this role, Katie leads the U.S. Bancorp Office of Global Ethics and Business Conduct. Katie joined U.S. Bank in 2002 as an employment attorney in the law division and served as Chief Employment Counsel prior to moving to Human Resources in 2007. Among Katie's proudest accomplishments include founding the U.S. Bank Employee Assistant Fund and the award-winning Proud to Serve program, and leading U.S. Bank's ethics program that helped U.S. Bank be named as one of the world's most ethical companies. Katie received her BA from Rice University in Houston, Texas, and her JD from the University of Houston Law Center. She lives with her husband and 2 children in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. Christopher Michelson is the David A. and Barbara Koch Distinguished Professor of Business and Ethics and Social Responsibility at the University of St. Thomas Opus College of Business. After earning his PhD in Philosophical Ethics and Aesthetics from the University of Minnesota in 1997, he helped launch a business ethics advisory practice, which became part of a global risk consulting network in the New York office of a Big Four firm. Professor Michelson came to St. Thomas in 2008 and is also an affiliate faculty member of the University of Minnesota's Center for Bioethics. He is the Humanities and Business Ethics section editor of the Journal of Business Ethics, on the editorial board of the Academy of Management Learning and Education, and on the executive committee of the International Society of Business, Economics, and Ethics. And finally, last but certainly not least, Tony at the end. Tony is Vice President, Corporate Compliance and Ethics at Target. Prior to joining Target in 2005, Mr. Heredia, Tony, spent 5 years as a management consultant with Booz Allen Hamilton in McLean, Virginia, and 13 years in California law enforcement. Tony serves on the boards of Meta and the Bush Foundation. Tony graduated from St. Mary's College of California with a bachelor's degree in management, and from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University with a master's degree in public administration. Let's give these folks a warm welcome. Thank you. Well, how this is going to be structured is we're going to have Eileen sort of give us a good grounding on what is artificial intelligence and what it's not. And I'm going to have you, Eileen, if you would, give the audience some background on what you do within IEEE that provides you that context.
Thank you, Colleen. I should probably tell you a little bit about IEEE. It's not very well known outside of the scientific community. It's an organization that was started by Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison. We are a membership organization with 430,000 scientists, technologists, and engineers around the world. We have operations in 190 countries. Our areas of business, we're not for profit, but our areas of business are publishing. We, at this point, own the copyrights of about 1/3 of the world's current writings in the area of technology and science and engineering. We're the most cited source of in defenses for patent applications. We sponsor 1,600 peer-reviewed scientific conferences per year, which means on any given day there is probably about 3 conferences going on someplace in the world. We are an education organization. We have e-learning. We do consulting for PhD programs in engineering around the world. And probably our most outward-looking and well-known area is our standards development organization. We are the owners of the standards for Wi-Fi, for the Ethernet, and we have about 1,000 standards that are used around the world. We're now working on a number of standards in the area of cybersecurity And I'll be talking to you about the launch that we've just done on the area of standards in ethics. So that's the background, and anything I know, I am, as you heard, a liberal arts person. So anything that you will hear from me is through the lens of somebody who's learned whatever I know about science through osmosis and just hanging out with these people. I'm a science and innovation groupie, I'll admit to that. So let me just set the table here as to what is artificial intelligence. And as a liberal arts person, instead of looking to mathematics, I think an interesting way to look at what is artificial intelligence is through world-class literature. I would say that this statement, to be or not to be, that is the question, is the essence of artificial intelligence. Because what this is telling you is that you have a binary system, which for those of you who know anything about computer coding, it is binary. It's a combination of 0 and 1 in the nomenclature of coding. And what this is saying is it's a binary system collecting, sorting, processing inputs, whatever those might be, from whatever sources. So the artificial intelligence is in what the input in those functions are. What is not artificial intelligence, what is human intelligence, is the rest of the quote. And as you can see, this is from Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind, that is thinking, to suffer indicates emotion. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, that indicates judgment of a situation. Or to take arms, that is decision to act against a sea of troubles. Troubles indicates an ability to evaluate, and by opposing, end them. That is incremental action to bring about results. So looking at that last portion, it is those processes and those elements that indicate what is human intelligence. Let's look at a more conventional definition. And this comes from the New Oxford American Dictionary. As you can see, it's a theory and development of computer systems that would normally require human intelligence. Normally is a questionable word. One example of visual perception, for example, is the facial recognition in photo sorting programs that are currently available. Speech recognition for those of you who use the dictation function on your smartphones, and its ability to understand progressively your accent or lack thereof. I know those of us from Minnesota think we have no accent. I'm sure that's what you feel. And the ability, after you've used it repetitively, to understand every word. Decision making. For example, if you're lucky enough to have Alexa and ask her to play classical music at dinner, and she chooses Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, that's decision making. Translation between languages, and for those of you who have seen written text apps, that's what those do. Those are examples of artificial intelligence. There are subsets of artificial intelligence, and these are listed in order of the progression of their development. Machine learning actually started in about 1958, and they are algorithms of computation analyses that can learn from and make predictions based on data. They're very simple, and it is a sorting function that is very, very easily done. And the value of that is that they are used in functions of data analysis and analytics that are would otherwise be difficult or infeasible to do. For example, email filtering or hacker analytics, which we are seeing more and more of. We're now moving into an area called artificial general intelligence. Or when machine learning first started, the functions were to do to bring about a particular end result. What is now happening in generalized artificial intelligence is that a machine, having learned to do a particular function, can use those learnings to do another similar function. A good example of that is any app that has played chess. The elements of the chess playing function, the algorithms, are now being applied, for example, to allow that same machine to play mahjong. In computer coding, it is an expansion of that. And that's what we're seeing a lot of now. The final area, artificial superintelligence, is what people fear most. And that is an artificial intelligence system that's capable of reprogramming and improving itself without human intervention. And when we think back to 2001, A Space Odyssey, with Hal having improved on himself, wanting to take over, that kind of fear and science fiction is what we're seeing in development and in beta testing right now. And with that, hopefully you're not totally confused. I'll turn it back over to Colleen.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really informative. And I should have said that there are cards and pens on your chairs if you want to. Jenna is in the back. If any of you have questions along the way, just raise your hand and she'll come collect your cards so that I can ask them. And we encourage questions throughout the program. So, just to kind of hone in on a little bit more, the concept or the idea of it's already out there. AI is sort of embedded already in some of the things that we see and some of the activities that we're involved with probably on a daily basis that we might not even know of. Katie, if you could give us some idea of some of the employment-related AI that U.S. Bank might be looking at, or the hiring practices, some of those functions would be great.
Well, a lot of companies are using AI in their hiring processes. So from just simply using it to screen resumes. Companies that collect resumes online get, in some cases, hundreds of resumes, thousands of resumes for a single job, and it's just simply very difficult to sort through all of that volume. And so they're using systems that can search for people who meet certain qualifications. And so that's a form of AI that companies use to try to winnow down their population of applicants to find the people who are most qualified. But some companies use tools to screen to try to determine who's going to be honest, who might be dishonest, who's likely to be a high performer. And they use various tools that have been developed by other companies to try to make those assessments and predict behaviors and outcomes. I would say those are two of the most common things that you're seeing companies do really in their hiring processes. But companies also have insider threat. I'm sure Target has something similar where you're screening employee behaviors, trying to identify patterns of behavior that someone is doing something they shouldn't be doing. I've read an interesting article that some companies scan email for certain words. There was an article it was in the New York Times a few years ago that Wells Fargo screened for the word workaround. Because they had determined that was a predictor of people who were going to break their standards. So they use all of these tools to sift through massive quantities of data that humans couldn't do and detect patterns that wouldn't necessarily be obvious to humans because it's such a vast quantity, and then they can use that to try to predict certain behaviors and things that might happen.
Tony, are you seeing things that are generally being done in the retail industry?
Yeah, and I don't think it's unique to the retail industry. I think it's become pretty widespread in most major commercial businesses. So to Katie's point, I mean, the reason you all can go get advice on how to structure a resume to use certain keywords that you map out of a job description is because the use of AI to scan your resume is so prevalent that now there are people out there becoming experts in that and teaching, law school students who want to land the right interview how to transfer the right key terminology into your resume so that it does get picked up and flagged. That's a key indicator that that type of artificial intelligence is being used. So I want to go back to something that Eileen said. So as a non-scientist, non-lawyer, go back to the basic phrase here that the inputs are what enable artificial intelligence. And one question I asked was, why now? Why all the conversation around this today? Well, we have self-driving cars. We have computers that are trying to learn faster than humans. But the real, I think, reason is because data has become, which is an input, every piece of data is an input. It has become so prevalent and available. And most people who generate data don't even know about all the data they're generating, who has it, what it's used for, what people tell you they will and won't use it for. And that's the reason why I think there's this growing surge of conversation around artificial intelligence. So if you think about retail as a broad sector, I can tell you things becoming very widespread. Facial recognition when you shop is becoming fairly widespread as a test case, at least, with no human intervention. Comparing kids who walk through the doors of a mall with known missing children, for example, that capability exists today. It's being sold by more than one company. Using it for forensic analysis. What used to have to be done by a scientist for either DNA or latent fingerprint comparison through a very manual multi-step process is now being automated by computers who can use reason to determine when they were right and when they were wrong and automatically improve their ability to create that analysis. Fraud detection. Everything from your credit card, turning it off when it detects something, to knowing when somebody returns things that are legitimate more frequently because they spend more money in that store, when this is their only return and they spend almost no money in that store, and being able to automatically flag those through a back-end process. You all have probably received marketing personalization and you wondered, how did they know I shopped at their competitor or bought certain products? If you're a company like Target, sometimes you push the boundaries too fast, too soon, and there's an article in the New York Times about how you're telling people they're pregnant, whether they are or not, because you're trying to use data to determine who might be a future customer of certain types of products. But even the detection of consumers' shopping patterns across all channels, digital or physical, across all competitors, is possible today. And so that enables companies like Target or Walmart or Best Buy or anybody else to figure out, where else are my customers going? What else are they buying that I should maybe take a run at? And how do I learn that fast enough through the deployment of artificial intelligence so that I know where to target certain marketing campaigns at the right point in time? Those are just a few examples of ways that these types of things are finding their way into very commonplace business practices.
Well, let me add on to that, because if you think about what we do, one of the key things that we've always used for many, many years fraud detection for is that, AI for is that fraud detection, because we're looking to see if somebody has hijacked your credit card. And I was telling my team a great story today. So I learned something really interesting a few years ago. My husband is an airline pilot, and our card was being constantly shut off. Because we had used it at Target during a certain period, so we were on a heightened scrutiny. But also, my husband's a pilot, so he's based in Boston. He would leave Boston on a Wednesday for a 4-day trip, and he might go to Fort Lauderdale, and then he'd go out to San Juan, and he'd come back through DC, and then he'd be in Austin, Texas, and he's buying a cup of coffee in each of those places. And our card got shut off almost once a week. But the best one was it got shut off one day because he bought our nephew a Petco gift card. Turns out online, he purchased it online. Turns out those are a big fraud item.
Yep.
Okay, so you know this.
Right.
We learned this. It's a very big fraud item. Apparently, Petco has a very liberal return policy, too. So people buy Petco cards, they buy a bag of food, and then they return it for cash. And so because he had bought this, it shut off our card. And we had no idea why it was until the bank told us. But they've detected these patterns using this massive amount of data to know that's a key. It's a key warning sign. One of the things we're doing is we are working with Salesforce, and I'm not saying anything that's not in the public sphere. If you go to Salesforce's website, we are one of their customer case studies. They have a product called Salesforce Einstein. And what we have been working really hard on is trying to break down the silos, information silos across our organization. So we have people who have a mortgage, and they might have a checking account, and they might have an auto loan, and this is just on your consumer side. They might be serviced out of 3 different units of the bank, and they might own a small business on top of it. And each group sort of had that data. And what we've done what we're doing in partnership with Salesforce is trying to bring all of that information together to be able to see the whole view of our customer. Because they're not doing business with U.S. Bank Home Mortgage, they're doing business with U.S. Bank. And so it's a really interesting exercise we're going through to try to break down those information silos so that we can better see what our customers' needs are going to be and to be able to present them with the financial solutions that they actually need and that are going to benefit them. So using that data and breaking down those silos is something that's really, really valuable to allow you to make a recommendation for what product you might need next. And banks are no different. But then on our payment side of the house, so it's not hugely widely known, but we have an enormous payments processing business where when you swipe your card on a terminal, on the back end in many places, that's us. So we know what people buy. We know where they bought it, when they bought it. We know, what type of shampoo they bought. We might know the specific items, but we know what people buy and where we buy. We know more than Target knows about your shopping habits. And what do you do with that data? And what's okay to do with that data? You could probably piece together who's having an affair. You might know who's renting hotel rooms at certain times of day when they live in a town where they live. There are things that you could detect. And so it is that, but just because you have it, should you use it? So that's some of the things that are being talked about is just because you have this data, can you use it? Not should you, and should you use it?
Well, and I think on that subject, when I think about why is AI such, well, it seems like it's been overnight, but it's been around for a long, long time. But why do humans have this quest to use the artificial intelligence or the data? It's really about we have access to all of this data, so shouldn't we use it? But one of the ethical considerations that I read in some of the IEEE materials that Eileen gave was that's a lopsided consideration. We don't know how to use it on our own behalf, and we don't use our own personal information, all this data that's being accumulated to help ourselves. Why should these companies be out there using this data to help them from a profit standpoint? So it's...
Yes, we call it data asymmetry.
Right.
Well, I think that's been talked about a lot since the Equifax breach, right? People talking about how do they have all of this information they collect on each and every one of us that we didn't necessarily give them permission to acquire and use and profit off of, and then not protect. So it's really been an interesting discussion just since that breach about these companies that have this amount of data, and I like that data asymmetry because I think that's a really interesting conversation that's starting to occur.
Yeah, and in addition to a particular company like Equifax having information that they themselves collected, there's data sharing, and so it's a compounding effect.
Well, and I think some countries, like Europe, with their GDPR, are trying to give and put in the hands of the individual more power over their own personal data. And I think we'll see a little bit more of that, but I thought that was an interesting concept, that this asymmetry between who gets the benefit of our private information.
You know, the term data asymmetry is new to me. A lot of this is new to me, I'll admit. I think the experts in AI are probably few and far between right now, and I think one ethical issue that we might face as a society is who are the haves and the have-nots in the world of knowledge about AI, and could that actually exacerbate income inequality, social inequality, political inequality, and so on. But all that is just a preface to say that this term data asymmetry reminds me of a term that we often use in business ethics called information asymmetry. Information asymmetry is when a buyer and a seller have different amounts of information. So for example, when a used car salesperson knows that the car has been through a flood, an engine replacement, been fixed after a crash and so on, and the buyer just sees a car that appears to be in pristine condition, the seller of the car can exploit that information asymmetry. And I think we face the same risk with regard to data asymmetry when customers don't understand how their data is being used, how much data is out there about them, how it can be exploited, and how they can protect it.
I think that's a really interesting assertion, Christopher, because if you think about, I mean, human beings' quest for information this is not new. And it often, your ability to secure more and better information often determined how well your tribe did, or how good your trade routes were, or how well you made off in trading, precious commodities for silks or something else. And so we have, our race, our civilization has always had this quest for information. I think that what makes it really interesting now is it's so plentiful, and we don't know where it all comes from and where it all gets generated. I think people just now, in modern times, are coming to grasp the magnitude of how much of this information is being produced and stored and traded and transferred and put together to analyze. I mean, entire governments are betting their ability to defend countries by their ability to create machine learning and pour tons and tons of data in to spot a potential attack or thwart a cyber attack, or read the enemy's movements before they even physically do anything. And so I think when you convey that over into how this might show up in our everyday lives, I think where the true ethical implications come into play is when you have business, government, or society leaders sitting around making decisions about how they should or shouldn't deploy examples of artificial intelligence in the name of better serving their customers, or better defending their market, or better serving people who maybe wouldn't have access to the same services. And you can see where it can do a lot of good, or it can do a lot of harm, either intentionally or unintentionally. And I think that's why it's important that people start talking about how to ask the right questions around this.
Well, and the potential for it to do good or harm lies with the stewards of that data. And I think with every new technology, and frankly with every product, there are ethical issues that relate to this question of, is AI being used for good reasons or for exploitative reasons? You can think about food, industrial solvents, and so on being used or misused by consumers. To what extent do the stewards of that, the manufacturers, the creators, the distributors, the marketers, have a responsibility for use of products in an ethical manner? And so in one sense, this parallels very familiar issues. In another sense, though, especially when we think about AI not just being taught by the humans who could misuse it, but AI teaching itself, this becomes unfamiliar pretty quickly.
There's a term, metadata, which you've probably heard as well, and it has been used as a shield to indicate that there is privacy of people, where information about individuals is aggregated and nothing specific about any one person is known. But within the aggregation of that metadata, or even its collection, there is bias. And so this, as a mechanism to protect privacy, is rather false.
I think the whole subject of bias when it comes to AI is really important for us to be exploring, because fundamentally, I mean, every one of us has biases. We have biases we're aware of, and we have biases we're not aware of, but we have them. And those biases, when we build these systems, we can transfer those biases into the system, and now you have a biased system. And then you have biased outputs. ProPublica did a study, I think it was last year or the year before. I just read about it the other day. It's fascinating, about how certain technology is being used in the criminal justice system and the time people are being charged. You're shaking your head, you know this. The defendant will take a questionnaire and answer a bunch of questions, and it will be used to predict whether they are high risk or low risk of reoffending. And that's supposed to be used in the sentencing to determine what's appropriate sentencing. Well, what they found in the ProPublica study was that African Americans were rated high risk and did not reoffend at twice the rate Caucasians who were rated high risk. So they were much less, dramatically less likely to reoffend, but the way this questionnaire was structured was things that had bias to it and resulted in this incredibly high rate of high risk, which was affecting how people were being treated in the sentencing process. It's just one of many examples of how bias comes into it. I think Google did something, I just saw, I didn't read the whole study, but about photographic recognition and who was trustworthy or not, and it was skewed absolutely against African Americans. So that the computer was rating them as less trustworthy or less honest. And the bias in the system, I think, is something that has to be very, very carefully addressed as we're building it, because I think that is one of the key ethical dangers in the process.
Well, bias in how the systems are created, but are there other things that representatives from organizations here today should be thinking about with respect to AI? Are there other reasons why they should care about AI? I think, Tony, you touched upon it a bit earlier about being competitive and staying, really keeping up with the marketplace.
Yeah. I can speak in the commercial space, when you have for-profit entities, I mean, often the difference between being competitive and not being competitive is how quickly you can adopt and efficiently utilize new technology. That's often the competitive differentiator that makes or breaks the market leader in any segment. It doesn't matter whether it's computers or retail or shipping or anything. And AI is no different. The competitive landscape in most commercial sectors will be determined by how effectively organizations, current or future competitors, can figure out how to use it best and most quickly. But that also means they're probably not sitting around thinking about the ethical implications of all of their decisions. Most business strategists didn't take an ethics class. It probably wasn't required in their business school back then. It still isn't in most today. And so and you can bet that there will be an organization in an effort to get a leadership advantage. They will push the boundaries. They will not stop to ask the questions. They will justify it in the name of human progress to see what's possible first and worry about the implications later. And I'm reminded of the pushback that Facebook got around privacy settings when it first became public, how much they were really collecting and what they were doing about it or with it behind the scenes. So I think that what I know that some of my peers have started talking about is how do you take this notion of creating an ethical culture in your organization and start to expand it so that you are talking to your business leaders, your strategy formulators, your heads of data analytics about potential implications of certain decisions and strategies, not because you want to stop them from doing it, but because you want to encourage a little bit more debate early on. Prior to deciding it's the absolute only way to defend your company or the absolute only way to hold off competitors like Amazon, and other folks who are more natively digital than some of the traditional companies like Target would be.
That makes me think traditional strategic planning and implementation happens before the risks are assessed.
Yes.
And so the strategy is set, and then it's the job of the risk manager, the compliance officer,
That's right.
to figure out how to protect. And Tony, what you're saying is that risk and ethics should be built into the strategic planning process.
Yes.
I had a conversation with my students last night about maybe elevating the role of the chief ethics and compliance officer or somebody else, but who is responsible within the corporation for strategic ethics questions? If it's not the strategists themselves and the ethics officer is just a program manager, then there's got to be somebody who is actually thinking about these issues early on.
Yeah.
And in some companies, depending upon what the business is, that should be taking place absolutely as part of business strategy. I think we're starting to see as we are in the age of communication and information, almost instantaneously through the internet, that the ethical function of transmitters of those information, for example, Twitter, Facebook, Google, can they hide behind the business function of simply transmitting, or do they have an obligation to make sure that what is being transmitted is accurate? They are replacing print news. There is a function for journalists that require them, at least in the past, to be accurate and truthful in what they write. Now with the new transmitters of information, that seems to have gone away.
Well, I think this is a good segue into what I think you will get to, Eileen, about what organizations are doing to address some of these issues. But one of the, again, in the readings that I got from Eileen, I was interested to hear that one of the recommendations from IEEE and the committees that they formed to look into these issues is to really get engineers comfortable around ethics as they create products and as they are, thinking through ramifications, and to really bring ethics training into that area. I thought that was really interesting. But in that vein, if you could get us grounded on what is being done globally and on a domestic basis to address these issues.
At IEEE about 2 years ago, a number of us came to the same conclusion simultaneously. We had several of us had gone to South by Southwest, which most people think is just a music festival. In fact, there is an entire week that's called Interactive, and we heard a talk about privacy and the ownership of one's identity, and how that has slipped away from us by virtue of the technology that's consolidating and taking data about us. And then, I guess it was last year, Volkswagen had its big blow up with an engineering issue that related to the transmission of the downplay of emission standards in their cars. And it was traced back to mid-level engineers who did something because they could, without any ethical considerations whatsoever. And what we all saw was the demise of the company, their stock having deteriorated, and essentially their movement to a different type of model. So what we formed 2 years ago was an initiative called Tech Ethics, and what we've been doing is putting on seminars regarding the societal implications of technology. We have a global initiative, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. You see on your screen the document that we have drafted on this. And also, we're looking at it from the perspective of development of standards. Now, our standards are adopted by corporations, by governments, and are the basis of consensus without a legal backdrop. However, in many places, particularly the European Union, our standards are being embedded in legislation. So in terms of our publication, what we had done was developed a program on ethically aligned design. And you can see on your screen what the subtitle is. The link to where this is on our website is under standards.ieee.org, and I recommend that you read our first version of it. The first version was released in December of last year. We are currently working on the second version, and I have the privilege and a heavy task of being the final editor of this publication. What we did is we created it by convening over 250 global artificial intelligence and ethics experts and put them together as basically a ground-up crowdsourcing, although quite an elite crowd. It was composed of scientists, philosophers, anthropologists, lawyers, ethicists, who came together in government, from governments, from academia, from corporations, and from individuals to look at specific issues. And the way we've got this organized is with 120 key issues that we've put together and recommendations. This is intended to be, hopefully, a go-to resource for technologists and policymakers, regardless of whether they're in industry or in governments, to prioritize ethical considerations in whatever their governance system is. We worked around the world. You can see, because we were very much aware of potential bias, and so we were concerned regarding having people from different cultures. You can see we worked in Asia, in China, Japan, Korea. We also have worked in Russia, Thailand, India, Mexico, Israel, Ethiopia. The group of people is fairly evenly balanced, despite the fact that there aren't very many women in the field. We're about 40% women in the technology areas that have added to this. We try to be inclusive. And we have, there were initially 10 committees that were formed, and there are now 13. I'm going to give you just the highlights of several of them. And we had a committee that basically duked out through many meetings, many email exchanges, general principles of what should be looked at in terms of how the world deals with ethical concerns in AI and AS. AS stands for autonomous systems, and as I mentioned, we got into this by virtue of the Volkswagen situation, and now we're actually consultants for the major German companies who want to avoid this kind of situation. Again, we're working with Mercedes and BMW particularly. The issues that we have identified are framing the principles of human rights. This is essentially a human rights issue. And for those of us who are lawyers and business people, there are also issues of responsibility, transparency, accountability, and as we go forward as a world, looking at principles of education and awareness as to not only what artificial intelligence is, but what we as a world will allow it to do. This indicates, in addition, let me go back for a minute. In our second edition of this, we started to look at issues of what constitutes well-being. What is the essence of happiness? And you've probably all seen the studies that have done about the best city in the world to live in, and National Geographic, for example, just came out with another study on what the best city around in various areas of the world are. And things that they looked at included job satisfaction and altruism. So what we think needs to be done in terms of artificial intelligence also is to prioritize what constitutes well-being. As I mentioned, we are also looking at autonomous intelligence systems, and this is particularly in self-driving cars. A lot of the publicity that you've seen about self-driving cars has been based on advice and the consultants from IEEE. One of the things that we came across and are working with the car companies on is there is a default programming in most cars which in a low visibility situation, and these are in cars that are currently on the market, and this was artificial intelligence that had no ethical input in it. The artificial intelligence in most cars in a low visibility situation where there are two obstacles in front of the car, what the self-driving car will do is if it is going out of control, it will move to the smaller object. That smaller object is very likely going to be a person or a baby. And so in having identified that, we know there are other coding elements that are being done in manufacturing, and we need to ferret those out and make considerations. I came across a story last week where there is a group in Bologna, Italy, that is trying to address this question by attempting to manufacture essentially what sounds like a joystick to be put in cars where the driver can decide what the default is going to be, or it won't be a default. They'll make a conscious decision as to whether they will make a choice. That is, if it is a human being, avoid that and smash their car and potentially kill themselves. A neutral choice, allowing the car to do a default, or what constitutes what they called an egoist decision, and that is to save yourself and the car at all costs. And the driver, when getting into the car, would make a decision. Personally, I don't think this is the answer, but it's interesting what people are coming up with. In ethical research and design, the committee has made it a determination. This is a message that we are putting out there. And this is to help avoid the fear or alleviate the fear that is surrounding technology right now. You can read it for yourselves, but it may be a small print, so I'll read it to you. Machines should serve humans and not the other way around. This ethically sound approach will ensure that an equal balance is struck between preserving the economic and the social affordances of AI for both business and society. As a guiding principle, that is what our organization wants to put out there as we look at these things. I just put up this particular committee, which is looking at the safety and beneficence of AIG, the artificial general intelligence that I talked about, and artificial superintelligence. So what we're trying to do is get ahead of the curve. We feel that we're probably about 2 to 3 years behind in even starting this conversation. And with regard to personal data and privacy, the curation of one's personal data so that the identity that we put out in the marketplace is one that we're in charge of, is to offset data asymmetry, which we talked about earlier. We believe that GDPR in Europe is making an attempt to do that, but the difficulty in coming to compliance with that and the enforcement with the huge fines is going to be very, very difficult for large corporations, and I'd be interested in hearing what you all have to say about that. But it is conceptually a step in the right direction, we believe. The next one is one that I'm personally uncomfortable with, but we decided that we had to address this, and this is reframing the systems of autonomous weapons system. And last week, I had the honor and the privilege of having a meeting with the head of the UN Disarmament Agency. And they are looking to organizations like IEEE to help advise on autonomous weapons and how to safeguard them. It's a very, very difficult situation, particularly if one accepts the reality that there will be war. And the UN is currently working on resolutions relating to this, and my group is advising on that. The Law Committee, which should be of interest to you, and goes back to an email that I received from Colleen just a couple of days ago about curricula in this area. What we feel is that there is much work for lawyers because at this point there are very few practitioners and academicians in the area. It was interesting when we were doing advice on the testing of autonomous cars. We had employees from IEEE with the various car companies, and I got a call as the general counsel of IEEE saying, "So what's the insurance coverage?" And it's a very difficult question to ask. I ultimately punted by saying we will cover whatever happens because these are IEEE employees who are engaged in work that has been authorized by IEEE. But make sure that each one of them is very comfortable doing this. We didn't ask our people to sign releases because that's pretty obnoxious, but we wanted to give them comfort that if anything did go wrong, they and their families would be taken care of. Happily, nothing did. It's also interesting to look at that because this one for lawyers, because the way our legal committee has worked is we are looking at issues regarding accountability, verifiability of systems, respect for individual rights, and legal accountability in case of harm caused by any of these systems. What we are also calling for in terms of government and industry stakeholders is to basically make an identification, and we really believe this is necessary at this time, to identify the types of decisions and operations that will never be delegated. In terms of operations, and this goes back to the mantra, just because we can, through technology, do something, that does not mean it's good, and it does not mean we should do it. One of the major debates we see is in the area of cloning, and also human cloning, and also genetically enhanced features. There have to be some decisions made on the governmental level as to whether this is going to be allowed. And what we believe is this has to be done on the universal level. It can't be a balkanization of you can have this done in one area of the world but not the others. We also are concerned about ensuring that there is human control, especially in connection with super enhanced artificial intelligence. And of course, again, the allocation of harm. So this was the area, and I really recommend that you take a look. If you're interested in this area, please look at our version 1. And as I said, version 2 is going to be coming out in December. The number of people who have worked on this has been extraordinary, and it's very, very intense. What's also very intense is the way in which IEEE goes about standards. What I'm showing you here, and for those of you who are, I don't assume there is one engineer in this room, this is what's called an engineering process task graph. And as manufacturing is done in any manufacturing process, there are movements, and this happens in robotics. This actually happens to be a task graph for the use of a robotic arm in eye operation. And what we are recommending in manufacturing is that where you see the hold, it's on the right side, third up, that at various points in the manufacturing process, that there be inserted in the actual process a pause so that ethical considerations can be undertaken in the manufacturing process. And we think that actually might work if it becomes part of the accepted standard for which, in which manufacturing is done. This was a concept that I shared with the head of the autonomous weapons disarmament function. And I think you might see that show up in the resolution, where there is a request in manufacturing to pause. We are now working on 11 standards. When IEEE goes into standards, we take all comers. There are about 20,000 people who work on our standards. One does not have to be a scientist. It is grueling work, though. If you think that, for those of you who are lawyers in the room, you think that our drafting, or especially drafting of legislation, is tough, you should see what it's like with a standard. The number of discussions on where a comma is inserted is just absolutely not mind-numbing. So, we go through a lot of processes and a lot of input of those who want to work on it. At the final, before any standard is adopted and put out by IEEE for adoption by any comer who wants it, and it's usually governments, as well as organizations on a worldwide basis. It goes through a legal vetting process, which also ends up in my office. The first one that we are currently working on, these standards take about 18 months to 2 years to become what we call stable before we're willing to put our name on it. And the first one is a standard relating to system design. What this is about is the pause point I mentioned. The second one, the transparency of autonomous devices, goes to the communication that is the basis and an open understanding of what constitutes default in cars, if default is going to be inserted. The third one on this page relates to the data asymmetry we all talked about. This standard relates to cultural and other assumptions that are the basis of predictive patterns that we had been talking about as well. The next standard with regard to child and student data governance, this standard, as it's being worked through, has a lot of universities as members who are coming to closure on what the data protection for students and children should be. With regard to employer data, this harkens back to other issues we identified earlier. I recently also came across an article that was being used in Europe, which had an example of a corporation that was using Fitbits and requested its employees to use Fitbits. The data from Fitbit was not only going to the personal website of the user, but also to the corporation. And it was being used as the basis on which anybody who used who used a Fitbit would receive a 30% reduction in their insurance premiums. One can see this as something a corporation would like, but what about the protection of the individual? The next one on personal data agents relates to the curation of identity. The 7007, it deals with an issue that is very dicey, and that is, in fact, the next two do, and that is artificial intelligence, which is now being produced, can have the effect of dampening or enhancing the emotional response of the user. This is particularly true in robotics. And the purpose of these standards is to make sure that governments and people using them understand from a psychological perspective what is actually happening. The identification of anthropomorphic features with robots is beginning to be a real problem in psychology. And so we feel that this needs to be looked at. The next item is pretty self-explanatory, again, on fail-safe designs for autonomous and semi-autonomous systems. And the final one, which we're not sure how this one is going to go, is a discussion of setting metrics for essentially what is the essence of well-being and happiness. Now, these are really interesting. They're outside of what normal engineers would be doing, but we feel that with artificial intelligence and the ethereal nature of it, we have to start having these discussions and make some determinations now, because this technology is moving exceedingly fast.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Do any of the other three panelists have anything to add or questions based on what we just heard?
Well, I just suddenly feel so cool and cutting edge because in one of my classes a few weeks ago, we talked about self-driving cars. I see a couple of my students smiling about that. And one of the interesting things about this is well, first of all, I'm thrilled to hear that well-being is a priority. As an ethicist, ethics is about not just right and wrong, but more broadly about human well-being. And questions of well-being aren't binary. Oftentimes, some of the questions that self-driving car technology might face, those answers need to be taught to it by human beings. So MIT has an experimental module where you can say how you would teach the computer how to make a decision about who ought to be the victims in an inevitable accident. Should it be the people in the car? Should it be the people on the street? How many people are there in the car? How many people are there on the street? What are their characteristics, and so on?
What are their ages?
What are their ages? Yeah, so it's easy when they are equivalents to your perception, and there are 3 in one scenario and 2 in the other scenario. But when it's 3 escaped convicts and 2 law-abiding citizens, then the question becomes just a little bit more complex. And then, as you said, ages and genders and species even, because there are dogs in the scenario as well. All of those things are ultimately complex factors that lead ethics to not be a science that can be decided in zeros and ones, but really an art. And can you teach technology the art?
I sent my entire team The Moral Machine yesterday. That's what it's called. It's called The Moral Machine if you Google it, and it's really interesting. And I've had a number of them come back to me with what their observations were. And I think it's an interesting question. Will the car really know if the person in the crosswalk is a bank robber or a brain surgeon? Because I don't think it will, so I think it's an irrelevant factor that it asks you to gauge. But I mean, I think to the point you were just making, we make decisions that aren't always rational for various reasons, and we base our decisions on nuances. And And I don't, how do we have artificial intelligence take those things into account when they're making decisions? I think that's going to be a really interesting thing as this develops, is how do those nuances and judgment calls come into play? It's going to be, it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch.
And I think what would really ignite the debate is when you marry those observations with all the research that says human beings are terrible decision makers.
Yes.
Because here we are reserving the right to make decisions over machines, believing that we will make a better decision, quote unquote, or maybe a more informed decision. But there are a lot of academic studies out there that say business leaders in particular are terrible decision makers. So that's an interesting aspect to think about as well.
Well, and Harvard in 2016 was granted $28 million by the government to study human brains and determine how human brains make decisions so much faster than computers. Because of, like, for instance, a computer to recognize a car, it has to see thousands and thousands of images of a car. Whereas you or I or any of us here, we can just see 1 or 2 images of a car and remember that that's a car. And so that, do you know anything about that initiative, Eileen? I think it's called, I have it written down, the Intelligence Advanced Projects Activity.
Yes, they are also struggling along.
Oh, really? Okay.
These are very, very difficult questions, and particularly since we really don't know how the human brain works. And if you reduce it to the chemistry and the electrical charges, that is not it, because there is an element that cannot be captured, we feel, by artificial intelligence, and that is everything in the second part of the quote from Hamlet. It has to do with, call it what you will, soul, spirit, life force. There is something else there that is not programmable.
So to
You
go,
know, on
go
that
ahead.
point, AI can already do all these things we've been talking about, and yet we are very early in the development that is accelerating. And that's tremendously exciting because AI has the power to make our lives better. It's also incredibly frightening because AI has the power to become more and more powerful, especially in the hands of those who might misuse it, or in some scenarios, outside of human hands. If technology becomes smarter than we are, then those doomsday scenarios that you see in films might not be so fantastical. But I think, by starting with a Shakespeare quote, Eileen, you're pointing to something that is very important about human beings. We might not always be the smartest species on Earth, if you call AI a species, but we will also always be a unique species on Earth. And one of the things that makes us human is our bad decisions, Tony. Our ability to make bad decisions because they're distorted by sometimes positive, sometimes negative biases. They're distorted by emotions. This morning I was doing some cramming for this panel, and I was reading about some in Silicon Valley who are trying to make themselves immortal by living on through artificial intelligence. And that reminded me of an old philosophical experiment called the experience machine, where you could actually have a virtual experience of life without actually living life, just as you could have something that appears to outside perception to be human without actually being human. And even though that's interesting and spooky and scary and fascinating, it's still not human if it's just having the experiences without really being conscious of having those experiences. And that's something that makes us uniquely human that I think that we should celebrate even as we try and control this.
I think that's an entire additional panel on augmented reality, which is terribly frightening potentially.
Well, just in the time that we have left here, I'd like to get to really getting from the panel what recommendations or what action items do you think that the folks in the audience that they can do now on behalf of the companies that they work for?
Well, I can tell you from experience, you can't wait around to be granted authority to be a voice on something. You know, I think most people who are responsible for ethics in an organization are charged with managing people's behavior, so to speak. But it's only about following workplace rules. It's not about thinking about the big things that nobody else is thinking about. But you can't wait. You can't go make a business case as to why you should be granted that authority. You have to go build the relationships with your internal company strategists, with your heads of data analytics. And you just have to be curious about what it is they're working on and what's coming next and what they view to be the differentiators in their market and why they're going to be thinking about certain things in certain ways so that you can just, if not influence the way they think about it, ask the right thought-provoking questions, but in a way that's not threatening to them, because you know the easiest way to get uninvited from the table is to be perceived as the person who's always going to say no to everything. But instead, if you can take enough interest and ask the right thought-provoking questions, I find that you'll always get invited back and probably to other venues that you hadn't thought about as well.
I couldn't agree more. I think waiting for permission is going to be a big mistake for all of us. You know, my approach has been really to develop those relationships. I've been very fortunate. I hired our chief privacy counsel last year, and he's very much sensitive to these issues and brings things to me, makes sure I'm invited to the table. I am fortunate too that I actually have a chapter in the corporate strategic plan specific to ethics. But we have allies around the company, you know, as we've built those relationships who make sure we get a seat at the table. We are, launching a emerging technologies governance committee, and a colleague of mine said Katie needs to be on that committee, and the tech guy said, why? She said, trust me, she needs to be on that committee. And so, you know, getting that seat at the table early at the beginning is really important so that we can start thinking about it, because if you wait, it's going to be too late.
Yeah, I'm going to put another vote in for ask questions. And I think one tendency that we often have is to assume that if it's a good question, somebody must be asking it. Somebody maybe with a little bit more courage than ourselves, somebody with a little more seniority, somebody with a little more specialty in this area. But many a disaster has happened because somebody assumed that somebody else was asking the question. You know, in the time that I've been teaching compliance and ethics from Enron through the financial crisis, those questions could have and should have been asked earlier. And I'll just say, maybe with more specificity, questions to ask might include, what are the foreseeable misuses of AI? And then, this might not be answerable, but still worth asking anyway, what are the unforeseeable misuses?
I have a question for you, Eileen. On this IEEE, the document that you sort of went through, it's called Ethically Aligned Design. I have it up here. It's 138 pages, and it's actually a quick read. I find
the new
this
one
stuff,
is 250.
Oh, the new one is? Okay. I find this very, very interesting, but who is this document really meant for? Is it meant to be read and digested by companies that create AI, companies that use AI? You know, what should the people in the audience do with this information? Because I really do recommend that you read it, just even as a human being in the technical world that we live in.
It's really meant for governments, regulators, and business thought leaders. For example, the World Economic Forum is very interested in this. On our level as compliance officers, I too belong to the Department of No, and I think that it's very difficult, particularly as a compliance officer, when you are also being asked to provide what the sanctions are for violation. It puts one in a difficult position. The document is for the knowledge of people on our level, but also it's a call out to governments, and we have had seats at the table. What I can encourage you to do is to look at the standards that we're developing, and all takers are welcome. On our website is a mechanism to join any what is called a working group, and with the disclaimer that it is torturous, but these are very, very important issues.
Well, and I would say the students in the room, I don't know how many are left now, but this document, to me, I had lawyer written, in various places, because it really is going to require the diligence and the attention of the legal community, and whether they're legal practitioners that are in the area now or the up-and-coming legal practitioners. It requires some attention, and I think that's really exciting, especially since we're a law school.
Somebody's got to write the legislation for these regulators.
Right, right. And just, enveloping the information that's in this document into your own compliance and ethics programs back at your organizations, and thinking about the ways that these committees have already done really a lot of the work of thinking of what all the issues are. And so really it's a matter of reviewing at it and really thinking through, how does this impact our company, and being very specific about that. Does anyone have any questions from the audience? I don't know if did you get a couple? Okay. This is the question. We can make ethical decisions about technology today, but is there any way to ensure that what we build will not be co-opted for unethical purposes through acquisition, hacking, or repurposing? So in other words, I think that even though it might be built with all of the ethical dimensions in mind, it still could be manipulated. And I think, and I'll let you all speak to this, but I think that that is thoroughly thought through in this EAD document.
I'm going to take a stab at saying, I don't think we know yet. Regardless of how much time we take to write rules, standards, procedures, guidelines, best practices, pick your label, they're only as good as one of two things happening. One, there's an authoritative source who has enforcement authority over people who don't follow them and actually follow through on that, which is in the minority of cases in any type of regulatory situation. Or it relies on the good-hearted, good-natured, commonsensical, rational judgment of people who want to behave in a manner consistent with which those standards, procedures, best practices, et cetera, were developed. And as soon as you talk about acquisitions or authorized, unauthorized takeovers, any of those kind of transference of that asset or that ability, it becomes a big unknown, especially in the business space, for sure.
If we're talking about business acquisitions, I think it really goes to the culture of the surviving entity. And I think what we've all been saying here is a call for a change in the philosophy and culture of particularly of businesses to take into consideration something more than the quarter-to-quarter profit statement.
Well, and what I meant earlier about it's thought through in this EAD document is that it talks about the fact that manipulation has to be considered and the ways in which a AI system can be manipulated. So I think that, and it's going to change, right, with every system and every product.
I'm more pessimistic. I think there's always going to be somebody out there looking to exploit it. And we have to be thinking about that. And I think Christopher's point that how could this be misused? Both what are the foreseeable and trying to think about what the unforeseeable uses could be on the front end. So you can try to mitigate for that. But there's always going to be people who are going to try to take advantage.
It's like the dark web.
Yeah.
I mean, a few of you have used the word culture, and every compliance system is a combination of culture and, which is positive and proactive, and then maybe more reactive security and enforcement. And I think we can build a positive culture and a positive method for using things right, but also have to take appropriate security and enforcement measures to prevent against wrong usage.
So I have one more question. Is there some kind of internationally recognized registry of companies that create AI? Or is that a possibility?
No, there isn't, and I would question what's the purpose of it.
Well, otherwise, how can governments track who's creating the products? Or is that not an issue?
I don't see it as an issue. I think particularly offices of technology in governments are pretty attuned to what's going on worldwide, and it's in part the internet that makes them so. And one would think that developing economies might not be as attuned, but in fact they are, because they've leapfrogged over the bricks and mortar infrastructure of information technology much faster than any place else. I don't see it as a problem.
You know, Colleen, one different way to think about that. So the way products are built, and the term product connotes different images in different people's heads. Most technology products are an amalgamation of other people's intellectual property that are found, twisted around a little bit, put together in a unique way, and then given a specific purpose. Most people who create certain technologies actually can't envision how they might be used in all the different ways in the future. But you could envision a scenario where if we decided the deployment of artificial intelligence in a productized way is a potential threat to human health or wellness, you could see a government entity like the Consumer Product Safety Commission saying, hey, here's our definition of AI. If you offer for sale, free or not, to any human user a product that contains or meets this definition or functions in any of these ways, you're going to have to start registering it with us, much like they do baby items or products containing certain chemicals or ingredients. You could see where that might happen over time, but my short amount of research and listening and learning from Eileen tells me that we're pretty far away from even agreeing on what a definition like that might be before a particular agency, let alone agencies around the world, could uniquely figure out how to do that.
That's exactly what I was thinking, where I was going with that. Thank you. Is there any other questions or comments from the panel? We're going to end up ending just a little bit early. We have a reception in the back for anyone that would like to join us and have a cocktail, and I think there's food back there too. But let's thank our panelists. I think this was a tremendously helpful gathering of really the right people to get this conversation started.